I'm going to chair the panel in the ambiguous discussion with my voice loud. So we have changed the order a little bit. So we're going to start with David Conrad, and unfortunately Carolina Novella has not been able to join us, but is she on Skype?
She will be listening
Okay,
in the
so
streaming. We are streaming.
She's in Barcelona.
Mhm.
And David and Carolina have been working together on this paper. David will present the paper entitled Mapping Utopias from Tahrir Square to Plaza Catalunya.
Thank you. So again, my name is David Conrad, and the study I'm presenting today focused on the people who participated in the 2011 Spanish demonstrations in Barcelona, Spain. I'm planning to talk a little bit about our findings. However, I hope to keep this presentation mainly focused on our study's use of a participatory research technique that we hope can be further applied in social movement research. And as Professor Rodriguez mentioned, I should start by saying that Carolina Novella, who is from Barcelona and who conducted nearly every interview we did in the local language of Catalan, also co-wrote this paper with me. But since she cannot be here today, I'll do my best to present this for the both of us. So as we try to make sense of grassroots organizing efforts taking place around the world, protests like those that happened in Spain during the summer of 2011 are continuously being boxed into didactic causal frameworks. Compared to the umbrella-labeled protests of the Arab Spring and Occupy, approached through the lens of social media, and rebranded with names like the 15M movement, the Indignados movement, and hashtag Spanish Revolution, to name a few. However, in an effort to contribute a different set of voices to these studies, our study focuses on the stories of the demonstrators in the middle. Stemming from a grounded theory research tradition, we engaged 32 in-depth interviews, community mapping, participant observation, and invoked a participatory technique which we are calling the story graph. This provided the 32 respondents with a blank slate upon which to map their personal experiences with the movement. By bringing academic conversations of embodiment, space, and social change to the streets of Barcelona, this study set out to contribute empirical research on the potentiality of the public square as a place for the disruption of urban and state processes, and the role of the liberated space as a notion worthy of further exploration in social movement research. Now, the 15M movement started in Madrid on the 15th of May, with a call for protests in 58 other Spanish cities. The understanding that was largely circulated through the media was that the demonstrations were in response to frustrations over a two-party system, increasing unemployment, and growing influences of capitalism, tourism, commercial interests, and political corruption. Now, I don't want to go too much further into these assumed motivations, but in order to show how the story graph lends itself to a protest setting that we think is very similar to those of other movements, I thought it would at least be helpful to describe the environment of the protest camp a little bit more. So challenging neoliberalist structures and values, participants in the 15M movement called for more direct participation of individuals in politics, as well as a reimagination of economic policies and social norms. As such, the movement defined itself as nonpartisan, peaceful, and assembly-based. With the intention of recovering the agency of the individual, one of the main features of this movement was consensus-based decision-making, through regular general assemblies and engagement of thematic action committees. In Barcelona, an encampment was created at Plaza Catalunya, the city's public square, on May 16th. And here you can kind of see a map that illustrates the internal structure of the square, along with its various committees focusing on issues of health, economy, education, and gender, and its operational work groups which oversaw internal issues like conflict resolution and free kitchens. There were also local action and theater groups, along with communication committees that facilitated assemblies, online communication, media relations, and both inter-encampment and international relations. So it is within this environment, one which was built upon group consensus, horizontal participation, and mobilization, and a decentralized identity without any clear hierarchy or leader, that we started conducting research. And it is in this setting that we tried to find a research tool that was somewhat in line with the spirit of this movement and the demonstrators. In an effort to address the importance of the square, or the space, or the public square itself, in social movements, the research questions that guided this study centered on the significance of the square to the demonstrators, and on how the demonstrators saw their participation in the movement. Focusing entirely on these demonstrators who were in the square, we conducted 32 interviews using a story graph method that I will describe in more detail next, and participant observation from June 12th to June 19th. And although we recognize that this isn't a very long period of time, we found this time frame to actually be quite lucky with the method, because for the most part, the height of the demonstrations in the square ended on June 19th. And so we were able to get respondents to trace their involvement throughout the course of the movement. And just so you can kind of visualize what the square looked like, this is a picture of Plaza Catalunya on a quiet day. And then this is it at a high point during the movement last year. For this study, we adapted a participatory mapping technique called the life graph. This is something we learned from Karen Greiner, who used the method in a study published this year on health issues among women in Appalachia. She said that by, quote, asking participants to portray their life visually and only after with words, the method added both texture and depth to their stories, end quote. So quite simply, instead of having members plot their life on a graph, we asked them to plot their involvement in the movement. To start each interview, we gave the participants a blank piece of paper and asked them to draw an X and a Y axis. They were encouraged to pick whatever start date they found appropriate and to allow the X-axis to be the days or events or whatever they wanted. The Y-axis then represented their level of involvement or connection to the movement. At this stage, the participants could define their involvement in any manner they wished, because the interview was designed to follow up on these points and conceptualizations later on. The most important thing for us was not necessarily how high or how low participants rated their involvement, but we were most interested in how these moments compared to one another, and especially in the significance they attributed to the events and days they rated at these highest and lowest points. So, in other words, we were interested in the causes of the moments that they chose to graph. In addition to adding a spatial dimension to the interviews, a helpful surprise with this technique was that it allowed the participants to afford exceptional focus on the interview and truly reflect on their experiences in an environment that was frequently full of noise and activity. It also allowed for the respondents to take control of the interview process. They knew that we were generally interested in how they viewed the square and their participation in the movement, but they really led the interviews. We would only ask about certain points in the graph or follow-up questions to things that they said. For instance, we would point at the very first dot in the graph and ask, can you explain this moment for us? Or what happened before this dot that led you to participate or to hear that the demonstrations were even happening? We videotaped all of the interviews, and so I thought I would just show a couple quick clips so you can get a sense of basically how this process went. Now this first clip shows how some participants would draw their involvement line fairly quickly and then add to it during the course of the interview. And this other participant shows kind of the other end of the spectrum. Some participants would take about 45 minutes to actually draw their graph, and they would spend a lot of time and attention on specifying each particular event, and they would explain it to us later in the, during the interview. And if we fast forward ahead in the very first interview, you can also see how some of the people didn't start with the 15th of May at all. This is an example of someone who started their graph with an event that happened over a decade ago. But for her, it was important to include in the storyline of that movement. Now, we are still interpreting our results, but so far our findings are centered around three general themes that address the role of the square as an extension of the body, a forum for situated knowledge, and a place for internal transformation. As an extension of the body, the participants frequently described the square as holding meaning even during times that they were not physically present. In other words, on days that they couldn't be in the square, participants said they would call or text people who were, or they would look at live photos and videos posted on social media sites. All of the graphs also shared the same peak of involvement in the movement, which was the day after the police had tried to come clean up the square. People didn't say they were retaliating against injustice or the attempted removal of the people. Rather, they told us that they came to defend the square. Finally, the protesters never articulated to us a desire to take over or physically change the city, to get rid of capitalism or to tear down a structure. Many of the people we spoke with said that if life returned to normal in the square a month down the road, they would still view the demonstrations as successful. We interpreted this portion of the interviews as suggesting that the Spanish demonstrations were more about momentarily liberating spaces rather than occupying them. Put another way, many of the demonstrators were making statements at more of the process level. They wanted to be included more in the processes that shape the city. In the case of the square, the interviews emphasized that it was an appropriate place to meet and to make a statement because it was previously only home to the pigeons and the tourists rather than the people of Barcelona. By taking over the public square, the change they were making on the city was not a structural or a physical one. They weren't breaking the windows of high-end clothing shops or protesting in front of cafes. But in the most tourist and commercial-centered spot of the city, they disrupted movement, largely the flow of tourists and elite Spanish shoppers. We found this sustained disruption of the everyday flow of life to be interesting and deserving of more attention in many of our conversations on social movements. So in closing, while we are still interpreting some of the interviews, with this presentation I hope to have helpfully shared our experiences with the storygraph method and to recommend it as a helpful participatory tool in fleshing out and conducting interviews and large demonstrations. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so here's where we are changing the order a little bit. So our second paper is by Pablo Rey from MIT, and the title of his paper is Arab Spring, Spanish Revolution, and Occupy Movement, Mainstream Media Coverage versus Twitter.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is this ongoing project that we are using to analyze mainly front pages of newspapers and Twitter. It's a way of comparing what the mainstream media are talking about certain news threads and what the social media are saying. It's related to what the previous talk, because everything started also in the Spanish Revolution and the Indignados movement in Spain. I am from Spain, and I was following all the news from Boston, where I am based now, and I was following the demonstration. This is the May 15th, and I was following how the front pages of the newspaper were covering this. So you see here, every column is one newspaper, and the surface that is marked is when they are covering about these news. So after the first day, some newspapers were covering it, and after the first eviction from the square, some more newspapers were having like small news, like small rectangles in orange. But still, the feeling in the squares and the people is what we're calling they're talking about a media blackout, and they were asking the media to cover more the events. Only after May 17, when the squares were really full, the media were like really covering and using the main part of the front pages on it. And after May 18, it was like the topic, like both the left and the right newspaper were covering it. So that was just a shortcut to analyze the media, but it turned out to be a good method to do this. So this is like the front pages of all of them covering this event. So what the other piece that we were needing is to cross this with the Twitter data. So what we can see up there is now we are using the horizontal axis and the time. And what we see up there is like the main hashtags. So the tags that we are using in Twitter to categorize some news. And so we were able to see like how the social media are at the beginning covering like the event and the newspapers, because they have on a daily basis, they are even one day later or 2 or 3 covering all these things. So we just instead of doing this manually, we automatized the process. We could scrap all these front pages from kiosco.net. This is a website which provides all these front pages. And so we could make it in a bigger scale and see like how the social media trend was declining after the first week of the protest, and only there were these big peaks after evictions or after special protests during the months of May and June. So 1 year later, so that means like it's like 10 days ago, we were repeating the same analysis. This is around the protest, the 12th of May. So we see different media covering the protest, but we wanted to go further and to use this not only to say this is the surface that they're using, but what are they talking about. And we could see in green are the ones that are just relating, they are talking about what's going on, and the red is that the right-wing newspapers just making editorial statements against the movement. So again, we could see that it was really a visual way to understand what the media were talking about. We repeat the same experiment with the Occupy movement. So what we can see here is in the horizontal axis is the time, and in red is the surface of the newspapers, the percentage of the surface for the newspaper. And what we can see in gray is the different tweets. In this case, we are so this peak, for example, is the eviction of Occupy Wall Street, and is followed by a day of all the newspapers are covering it. So to give you a sense, this is what we see here is the Wall Street Journal, and we can cover it in the very same moment that they are evited. And so it's interesting because we can see both the data and also the analysis at the same time. We can see by newspaper and so it's turned out to be like a shortcut for analyzing how the mass media are covering and also showing the data. It's so important. So we have like both analysis and not this kind of analysis we do like a lot of the newspaper and spreadsheets that we don't see. So we just at the same time we see the analysis. So we've done this still manually and with this program that is helping us this process. For example, here with the Haiti earthquake in the Spanish newspapers, and we are watching this kind of 2 weeks cycles of the news that is kind of similar here in the Japanese tsunami. So we see how the first day, especially after this big event, all newspapers are covering in it, and we are always using the percentage. So we are never using the actual surface. So because it let us compare different newspaper sizes and different countries, especially for example, we are using Spanish newspaper and US newspapers that they are so different in size, and also the number of the news that are in the front pages. For example, the average in Spain is around 4.7 news per front page, and USA could be like 17 or 11 if we covered like the smallest snippet. So here we made a comparison between the in blue are the US newspaper, and in red the Spanish newspaper, and it's again in the Japanese tsunami, and we see kind of a similar curve on how they are covering the events, and we see here a big drop, which is related to the Libyan war. So what we see here is that in green are the different events related to the Arab Spring in the front pages of the Spanish newspaper, and here is in red is the Japanese tsunami. So it seems like that the newspapers, or at least in the front pages, you can only have like only covering one thing. You cannot listen to. So we've seen that quite in different situations. So it's like one thing at a time. They can only cover. And we see in the Arab Spring was kind of the same. Here we see Egypt. Then we see Libya, and Libya, so they cannot do like revolution, or they cannot be at the same time. They cannot and well, this is with first is Tunisia and then Egypt in the January and February from last year. So we are kind of watching this similar patterns. This is another. I just some examples. This is how we compare the detention of Strauss-Kahn and the Spanish Revolution. How the two news are like colliding at a certain moment. And this, for example, is another way of using this. Is just how two different news are being compared across the time. So that we are comparing here the earthquake of the Haiti and the Japanese tsunami, and how they follow similar trends. We should apply this to more events, so to understand how the news are flowing, at least in the front page media system. So what I wanted to tell you about the project we are now we're going to develop this summer is Phase 1X, is about making this process online and available for researchers or for advocacy groups to be able to track online what the news are covering, how they are covering. So the idea is to scrap all the news front page newspapers and make an interactive design, which is now just like a one shot, not to be able to monitor different trends. So this is going to be during the summer, and this is going to be more or less that you can follow a special thread, you are presented with one front page. Depending of the patterns also different from every newspaper. So we were thinking first of like someone was going to make all this pattern, but then we are moving to this kind of thing where people can themselves there's a grid and people just are drawing, which is the news that they are interested, and then they just tag. In this case, perhaps you want to follow all the news that are related to Afghanistan, but we also kind of think in the content of the news, but for example, who is writing it, if it's a woman or a man, or to make if it's international news or national news. So it's a way of measuring what the media are talking about, especially in the front pages. So this will be stored in a database. We can use like cross-source analysis, so different people is analyzing at the same time, so we can compare the results and in the end produce similar graphics, but in this case interactive. So we can choose one newspaper, we can see the front page, and stuff. So the idea is this is a first step to measure the media, but in the future perhaps we are thinking of using the TV transcripts or the radio transcripts, or even also the the front page of the online newspapers. But they change every, I don't know, depends on the newspaper, every hour or 3 times a day. So that's a challenge, but also interesting as the media are moving towards that direction. And also the other piece we have is Twitter. Well, I forgot to mention, we are with Mate Stempek, we are collecting all the tools that are now online that you can use to track the media. It's basically analyze media tools, and so it's a collaborative project where people can just put there the different tools people are using. And so I just want to show in the last example here, this is the Trayvon Martin case, and we are compiling here 3 different types of media. We have the thin line is the tweets with Martin or with Trayvon. So we see in orange is the newspaper coverage, and in green is the signatures in change.org. So the idea is to be able to compare different media sources at the same time and to be able to see which are the relationships one to each other. And so the part that is missing is how we take the data from Twitter. All these examples you'll be watching, I will be using the data for Trendistic or from Topsy.com or from Archive. And the idea in this project is we are trying to make a comparison of how to gather this data for our research. And so we're comparing Scrapper Wiki, Topsy, Archive, and comparing it to the file host, which is all the data from Twitter itself. And we are now conducting this experiment the last events from the anniversary of the Spanish Revolution. So it's now online, and you can see. So everybody interested in beta testing this project during this summer, just contact me. And thank you.
Okay, the next paper is the title is Occupy-Indignados, Social Communication Practices Across Platforms, and the author is Santa from MIT.
Hi, so I'm presenting Mike Check, the Culture and Occupy movement. I'm Sasha Chap, and I'm assistant professor at Comparative Media Studies at MIT. I also am co-PI at the MIT Center for Civic Media, the fellow at the Berkman Center, and I'm a co-founder of the Occupy Research Network, which I'm going to talk a little bit more when I talk about the methodology of this project. So I actually don't know if I really need to show this. Sorry. So actually you can't hear this and we don't have sound, but this is just an example of the technique known as the people's mic. In this case it's being used by Talib Kweli, a well-known MC, basically talking about media practices and prefigurative politics in Patty Park. And so you'll see them talking about different technologies and different modalities for circulating voice. And so I like to sort of start with this clip in terms of thinking about what it means to be a producer of collective identity and media texts in a social movement context, in terms of thinking about how people create and circulate text across every platform that they actually have access to, whether it's voice, smartphone, drawn signs, which we'll see in a moment, and how those texts then find their way into mass media spaces. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit are concepts of media ecology and media culture. And I'm using this term media ecology to talk about the broader media space, which is rapidly transforming, which we can understand if we think about the political economy of the media system, the technical affordances of the available media platforms, especially those which are most popularly used by social movement participants. That's also sort of shaped by the general levels of ICT access and what I call read, write, execute media literacies in the population. And of course, there's the element of legal and normative constraints on speech. And so within that broader media ecology, I think it's important for us to, if we want to understand what's happening when we think about the relationship between media and media practices in the social movement space, to not do this sort of constant repetition of platform-specific analysis that says the Twitter revolution, the Facebook revolution, the radio revolution, the small cassette revolution, etc., which can go on, forever, to actually think about the broader social movement media cultures. And so I'm calling this tools, skills, practices, and norms that social movement participants use as they create, circulate, curate, and amplify movement media or movement voice across platforms. I'll skip transmedia mobilization for now. This is the work that Pablo has done, which he just sort of walked us through. And I think that this is sort of one step towards thinking about how we might visualize or map the broader media ecology. And I don't really need to do this in the do I need to do a timeline of Occupy Wall Street? Probably not. No. Do I need to not? Should I skip the timeline? Yes, okay, I'm skipping the timeline. So we all have seen this multiple times. Although I haven't heard anyone yet talking about the role Anonymous played, I just want to flag that as something that's interesting and important. Anonymous, a collective, loose identity in terms of the role that it played in initially giving a bump of visibility in the social media space and activating certain political networks to support the growth of OWS. Of course, okay, so this, of course, is the famous pepper spray video, and we've seen in a couple presentations already today that this is actually the key moment that bumps OWS into mass media visibility. I'm going to talk about that more. Arrest on the Brooklyn Bridge, the same thing happens. And so what I'm doing here is embedding sort of some of the key videos into the larger media surface text that Pablo's shown. And again, I won't take time here because we also don't want to do the timeline. But what you'll see is that there are these key well-known media texts that are movement-produced texts, which actually, if you zoom up, you'll see that's where the Twitter spikes are. And then the next following day, you'll see the front page of the newspapers, covering them. So again, thinking about how these texts flow across the different media spaces. This is October 15th and hundreds of worldwide mobilizations. But I'm skipping all that. Media culture. So what's interesting to think about not only how the media text that movement participants produce flow across different spaces, but also how the production practices also move across time and across movement networks through what folks like Suzanne Stagenborg and Silke Roth call biographical analysis of movement participation. So again, this is just the idea of thinking about what are some of the outcomes of social movement activity. It's not only policy outcomes, it's not even only cultural or discursive outcomes or mobilization outcomes, but we should also think about how individuals' life courses and biographies are shaped by their participation in movements, which they then take with them into other institutions, into other movement networks. Basically, they carry their movement participation with them throughout their life, and it often shapes the way that people think and engage with in every space that they then enter. And in the case of media production practices, media practices also move in this kind of way. So the clip from Khalid Kwale doing the People's Mic, I have another sort of follow-up clip, which is from This Is What Democracy Looks Like, which is a feature-length documentary produced by Big Noise Films together with the Indie Media Network. And it's just a clip of people using the People's Mic in front of the jail solidarity action in Seattle in 1999. So I don't actually have to play it. It's just to know that these techniques exist and move across movement times and spaces. In this case, from the anti-corporate globalization movement of the late 90s and early 2000s into OWS. We also see particular types of production practices. So these are all images from tents, so media tents, media teams, working groups within different OWS camps. So here's the media tent at Occupy Boston with a bunch of people in a situated, embodied context, sharing skills, tools, production practices. Some of them were former Boston Indie Media folks. Some of them were new movement participants, all learning how to use different tools in the process of documenting and circulating movement ideas. This is a little zoom into a poster in the background explaining to people how to get onto IRC. Raise your hand if you know what IRC is. So a couple people. So IRC is Internet Relay Chat, which is one of the oldest forms of simultaneous real-time communication. It's very low bandwidth. It's just a chat. It's a chat tool, which was widely used by Occupy media teams to coordinate across different sites. And the sign says, IRC is a really, 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 and really is underscored 3 times, old form of communication that people used to use in indie media. And if you go there now, you can learn interesting stuff. So these are just more media tents, Occupy London, Occupy LA. So we see the similar type of practices circulate. But this is, so the World Social Forum in Brazil in 2009, and below that is the sort of G8 protest in Scotland in 2005. So Reclaim the Media organized this physical space where people were sharing production practices. You can see it looks much the same. The computers are a little bit bigger, right? The monitors are large. But these same types of practices, continue across time through the network. In a similar way, the live streams, which got a lot of visibility in OWS context, there are sort of whole prehistories of this, tracing back from sort of global revolution through to Wisconsin in March 2011, where people were live streaming the labor mobilizations there. Dream activists in 2010 were live streaming their sit-in at Senator McCain's office. And actually, Vlad Peitzberg, who's right here, who's one of the co-founders of Global Revolution TV, was at the RNC in 2008 getting trained by Citizen Media Group Uptake in how to use mobile phones for live streaming in protest coverage. And then even before that, here's Deep Dish TV in 1986 doing live satellite coverage of anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now, of course, at the time they had to raise the money to have a satellite truck so that they could do the live coverage of the mobilization. So it's not a, being able to do it from a smartphone, of course, lowers the barrier a lot and allows a lot more people to participate in this practice. But the idea of doing this is something that had circulated for a long time in the networks. And Didi Hallett, who's one of the co-founders of Deep Dish TV, was also one of the co-founders of the Indie Media Center, and brought a lot of these interesting ideas about how do you pull together people to do this kind of coordination of live coverage. So again, individuals, practices, they all move across time and space. Maybe I'll just skip the social media stuff. I probably only have 7 minutes left. So this is a series of visualizations from the Occupy Data Hackathons, which were one of the practices that came out of the Occupy Research Network, which was an open, distributed, participatory community of researchers who both identified as occupiers or as movement engaged researchers that we sort of put together in the first days after September 18th we started, and it grew to be about 350 researchers from tenured faculty to occupiers and everywhere in between, kind of sharing ideas, strategies, tools for doing movement research. And one of the things that came out of that was a series of hackathons where we worked with Archive to visualize this data set of 13 million tweets related to the Occupy movement. But maybe I'll just, I don't know, we could talk about this later if anyone's interested in it. I think we've had enough Twitter visualizations probably. Does anyone want to hear about these Twitter visualizations, or should I move on to other theory stuff? This one, okay. So this this is a visualization of 14 @reply hashtags that was done by the team in the team from Utrecht that participated in the data visualization hackathon. And what you're seeing is each node is a Twitter account, and each color is a different Occupy-related hashtag, and the distance between them is basically the @reply frequency. And what it actually tells us is that some occupies are more closely related to each other than others. So up here is Utrecht, which is less tightly integrated in terms of retweeting and doing @replies than some of the other occupies that we were following. And I'll send a link around to this Prezi, and there's a link to the full description of that particular visualization there. So this tells us about sort of movement networks and how tightly connected they are. This is a visualization about the content of links in tweets that people are sending around by link category. Again, I don't want to just do this. This stuff gets boring. This is fun. This was in a hackathon. You have to have fun too. So we scraped all of the tumblers with the pepper spray cough meme, where people had been remixing, this image, and then generated a pepper spray cough super meta meme, where if you zoom into it, it's entirely composed of smaller images of pepper spray and cops, and documented the whole process of how do you do this with free open source tools, so that other people who might want to do this type of thing could do it. So if I had more time, so basically each of these spaces is sort of a different sort of type of media production practice. And within each one, what I do is I kind of trace them through time across different social movement networks and social movement spaces to help us think about this broader field of media cultures in a social movement context and escape this endless sort of focus on platform by platform. This is more, so one of the other projects besides the data visualization that came out of the Occupy Research Network is the Occupy Research General Demographic and Political Participation Survey, which we call ORGS, which again was a survey developed through an open participatory process by all the people over here on the left. And we did trainings and webinars for people who were occupiers in different camps to learn how you could actually administer a survey, how do you do random sampling methodology in a crowd context. Unfortunately, it was supposed to be a multi-site face-to-face survey of standard measures of political participation as well as media use measurements, and then just as we were about to launch, all the camps were displaced by police. So it ended up being an online-only survey. So that has some problems in terms of the external validity of the findings, but it still tells us a lot of interesting stuff, which I don't have time to talk about here. So I'll just show one, which is media use among people who identify as occupiers. So we asked people, this is if you use this platform in the last day, in the last week, the last month, never, but more than a month ago, and never. And so it has some interesting stuff in there around sort of frequencies of different types of media use, which by and large what I would say is that they mirror media use in the general population. The social media ends up, if you go into the data, the social media ends up being important, but the most important ends up being sort of face-to-face communication about the movement, which is not surprising to anyone who's participated in movements or who's done a lot of studying of social movement stuff. But again, the way that stuff is represented, especially in the popular press, you would imagine that this had somehow fallen away in terms of importance. It is what you expect in terms of the declining importance of broadcast media in terms of where people who identify with the movement talk about where they're getting information. Not a lot of people are talking about getting daily information from TV, radio, and print media. One more minute? I'm done? I didn't see the 12 yet. Where's my 12? Okay. So I'll conclude by saying that coming out of this work, I'm trying to develop and think about how we might characterize media cultures and look across different social movements. And these are some of the areas in which I'm examining how media cultures differ from each other. And I should have skipped all that data stuff so I could get more to the theory here, because this is where it starts to get a little more interesting. But we'll have to do it later in the movie. So I'm done.
Thank you. Okay, our last paper is titled When Artists Are Out of Work and Make Protest Signs in the Digital Revolution Era. And the author is from the University of Pennsylvania.
So now I'm going to take us way down to the low tech. So the early months of the Occupy movement in the United States were marked by an abundance of news images of protest signs. The very first article that covered the protests on the NewYorkTimes.com led with this image. It's a handmade #Occupy Wall Street sign held by a person in the square that invites individuals to participate online through Twitter. 2 days later, the first two articles to appear on the WallStreetJournal.com discuss the, quote, social media-fueled Wall Street protests while leading their articles with images of handmade signs. So even as the press clamored to coin another digital revolution, handmade protest signs dominated news photography. My paper analyzes photographs of signs that were distributed online through mainstream news platforms. My research seeks to understand what made images of the signs so compelling to digital news sources and considers what work those images accomplished in the mediascape. I argue that signage photography not only symbolized left political aesthetics for journalists and readers, but it also became a medium through which protesters could challenge press delegitimization. Activists used media-reflexive protest signs to speak directly to the media about the media's coverage. In so doing, they astutely mobilized press narcissism, or the press's love of covering itself, to propagate their media critique. And they did it through a symbol that the press has historically used to discredit social movements, the handmade placard. By analyzing mainstream press coverage, my investigation suggests that protesters developed a sophisticated message-making operation, not only through social media, as we've been talking about today so far, but also through press-savvy interventions into the mediascape. My conclusions are drawn from analyzing the use of signage photography by 3 digital news sources, the NewYorkTimes.com, WallStreetJournal.com, and the HuffingtonPost.com, between the period September 1st to November 30th, 2011, roughly the first 2 months of the protest. And what I have found is that images of and commentary on the protest signs were used in many cases to delegitimize the protests and to provide visual evidence that the movement had no clear message or goals. And this finding is consistent with McLeod and Hertog's explication of the protest paradigm, which predicts that social movements that challenge the status quo will be marginalized by the media. Yet, by visually analyzing the images themselves, I also found signage photography to be much more open to interpretation than might be expected of images inscribed with text. I suggest that the repeated use of protest sign photography across press outlets demonstrates that they were effective news images precisely because they were open to interpretation. The allure of protest sign photography would then derive from its as-if nature, not only from the social control motivations inherent in the protest paradigm. And so here I'm drawing on Barbie Zellizer's extensive work on the use value of subjunctive images in the news. And in her 2010 book, About to Die, Zelizer explains, quote, the as-if suggests rather than establishes evidence, end quote, allowing institutions to use images to coax public sentiment just as viewers can alter, accept, or reject what they see. An example from the WallStreetJournal.com demonstrates how protest sign images are open to interpretation and can be used to multiple political ends. On September 28, 2011, 11 days after Occupy Wall Street began, but prior to the galvanizing Brooklyn Bridge arrest, pundit Evan Newmark aired a video segment on the Wall Street Journal's website expressing his disdain for the protesters. At 46 seconds, Newmark says, "What exactly, I ask, is the point of these protests?" Right as the camera cuts to B-roll of a sign that says, "End the war, feed the poor." The screenshot of that moment uses the intertitle, shows the intertitles that the producers used, reading "Protest without a point." Newmark uses the visual of the protest sign to belittle the demonstration, and perhaps to prove that the movement has no clear message. However, the image the producers chose expresses a very clear motivation and a policy recommendation. Activating the protest paradigm, Newmark only sees the sign's diluted aesthetic and uses it to deride protesters. Yet another viewer may see rationality and consistency in the sign's message. Delegitimization, then, is not the only use value of these images. The protest paradigm can operate amidst the as-if. Conceptualizing it as such challenges the unidirectional power of media framing and opens up new ways to read the mainstream media for Occupy activists' strategy and agency. The signs may have appeared bizarre, arbitrary, and inconsistent to some, and may have been intended to advance that agenda, but they also demonstrated an individual's power to make a message, similar to what Sasha was saying actually, invited widespread participation, and used the press circulation as evidence that media corporations could be forced to listen to people. As Occupy protests spread in early October, digital news sources used photo slideshows to reflect the geographical diffusion of Occupy. Almost every location documented on the 3 news sites was represented by people holding protest signs. So I'll show several images that were included in the Wall Street Journal slideshow titled "Protest Spread Across the U.S." And as I go through these, notice the variety of demands and messages that were captured. So this is in New York, and you can see things range from "Let's get free" to "One Earth, One Humanity, One Love." And this is in Philadelphia with the clever "If the environment were a bank, we'd have saved it already." And this is in Indianapolis with the recurrent "One day the poor will have nothing left to eat but the rich." The New York Times also ran a slideshow that week called "Street Protests Continue to Spread." And this is in Charlotte, and again, you can see references to the 99%, honk if you're in debt. And this is in Salem, Oregon, the very prominent jobs demand. So the signs here functioned as a symbol that connected the events across these diverse locations. But the slogans on the placards also reinforced the diversity of participants' agendas and issues and lent visual evidence to the media narrative that Occupy was fractured. In the New York Times slideshow, though, Boston activists speak back. A demonstrator holds a large handwritten cardboard sign that says, "We are not disorganized. America just has too many issues." Here, the protester reflexively responds to the media's dismissal of the movement for its incoherence. Similarly, in one of the images in the Wall Street Journal slideshow, the sign "Give me some credit" is visible in a crowd of marchers in D.C. The slogan references the mortgage crisis of 2008 and is a policy proposal to reform lending practices. It also demands public and press recognition of the demonstrators' efforts and political and intellectual acumen. Challenging negative media frames, the sign asserts the protesters' legitimacy, which is underscored by her clever pun. The protesters' use of media reflexivity subverted the protest paradigm by transforming the signs into evidence of savvy citizenship. And in fact, many of the media's favorite signs contained messages contradicting press representations of the movement. So a sign on the Huffington Post list of Occupy LA's best signs says, quote, "They control your food, your schools, your medicine, your money, your media. Take it back." Its originality piqued a photojournalist's interest. Its call to arms was amplified to the onlookers in cyberspace through digital media distribution. The protest sign uses the online press for its own ends, while implicating the media with the power structure. The preponderance of media reflexive signs on press best of lists attest to how effective this media strategy was. The press's desire to be the subject of news helped Occupy activists distribute their self-representations and media critiques. So these 2 images come from the Christian Science Monitor's list of best Occupy signs. This was a popular theme that happened in the middle of Occupy, which included several counter-narratives. For example, "Not a jobless anarchist," and "I do have a job. I'm here in my spare time. I am the 99%. So these signs speak directly to media pundits who downplayed the protesters' concerns, such as the now infamous Bill O'Reilly quote, who said Occupy protesters were, quote, jobless because they don't want to work. All these people, all you have to do is take a shower, and they can get a job if they went to college. The signs acknowledge that dominant media narrative and challenge press delegitimization then by asserting the protesters' respectability. In an even more direct response to Fox News, a young woman poses confidently behind a sign that reads, "Don't worry, Fox News, I don't take you seriously either." Using her placard as a shield, she deflects right-wing media criticism and disarms its power by playfully infantilizing the media giant. Her expression of mutual disdain indicates that she is aware of the media framing of the movement. Instead of defending her representation, however, she shrugs off Fox News' power, taking back her agency as a media maker. A final example simultaneously illustrates signage photography's openness and protester use of media reflexivity. A young woman's sign reads, "If you don't understand why we are here, but you can name all the Kardashians, it's time to turn off the TV and pay attention." She invokes the media narrative that Occupy does not have a point, yet she resists revealing why she is there. Her use of "you" directly addresses her audience, even as the specific addressee is left ambiguous, so she could be speaking to the public or to the media. Her statement to pay attention is actually a demand, but her sign also converses with the viewer, whether or not the viewer sees him or herself as the attack's intended recipient. The openness allows any one viewer to be simultaneously spoken to, in on the joke, and a passive voyeur. The protester deploys pop culture and condemns TV watching by holding a placard in the square, while distributing her message through digital photography and the internet to the addressee's screen. Positioning herself as multiply media literate, she questions who's out of touch by turning that particular press criticism on the ambiguous "you." So my visual research then demonstrates how the protest paradigm can be seen in news use of signage photography. However, reading these images through their more expansive as-if nature makes visible a subversive mainstream media strategy deployed by some protesters and uncovers a more dynamic relationship between grassroots and corporate media makers. Media-savvy activists inserted themselves in the news with reflexive placards that caught the attention of the media and the public alike. Denied visibility and then ridiculed by the press, the protesters turned their creativity on the mainstream media itself, and the press took the bait. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to make this very short so that we have plenty of time. I would love to hear what Sasha has to say about that last part that you didn't. So let's see. I have to start by saying that when Carolina Novella asked me to be the respondent for this panel and send me the abstracts of what they were working on, I was really honored and convinced that I was going to be part of the best panel I did. And now I'm even more convinced. So thank you. It's excellent work. There's only a few things that I'd like to stress. One is in terms of different modalities, I think it's very exciting to see how there's a parallel in the different modalities that the activists are, in which they're using the media and coming up with creative ways to use the media platforms available, but at the same time, the different modalities in which they're doing research. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a parallel there in creativity that is really exciting. In terms of methodologies, I mean, what Pablo showed us, where you can see the data and at the same time see the analysis. I mean, I see all kinds of convergences here. On the one hand, seeing analysis and data at the same time. On the other side, the convergence of media analysis into media ecologies and not these fragmented medium by medium that we were seeing for so many years. So that's, I think, very exciting. Another methodological innovation is what David and Carolina are doing with the graphs, and I just wanted to tell you about a methodology that we kind of stumbled upon during an analysis, evaluation of community media, community radios in Colombia. And one thing that you could think about going into, and that this is what we stumbled upon, is that when we were doing something very similar, where we were asking people about their participation in community radios, but instead of the researchers being the only ones listening to the narratives, we actually had the respondents divided in groups. And in those small groups, each narrative was heard by all the people in the group. And then we had a plenary where they themselves started identifying patterns and trends. And what was amazing from this is that the methodology itself became an empowerment moment for the people. And from individual memories, the methodology actually created a collective memory of the group of activists. So these people that came as respondents left as the group having reached another level where they left with a collective memory that wasn't there in the first place. And so maybe, we collectively what can work in these methodologies becoming in themselves political actions that will strengthen and empower the activists who do research with and about. In terms of media ecologies, also one thing that I'm seeing all the time being done by young researchers, not just you, but also some grad students that I'm working with, is this, not only the media ecology in terms of the whole environment in which people use technologies and communicate, but also the very, very long-term longitudinal studies. And what Sasha was mentioning in terms of, going back to indie mediums in the early 90s or late 90s, early 90s, and also even way in the past with Paper Tiger Television and Deep Dish TV. We could even go further back, and I still have somewhere in the Our Media website document, for example, a paper where Sherry Herman, one of the founders of Indie Media Seattle, talks about how the Zapatista communication movement influenced that, and so we can go, keep going back and back in those longitudinal studies. And I think that will really allow us to understand that. And finally, just the last thing I was going to say is in terms of two things that made me think about this is when Sasha's talking about the tent, and Carolina and David are talking about momentarily liberating spaces, I think there's one aspect of all this movement that I don't know, but I think we should look at more in detail, which is how it is the lived experience at that moment that in itself has political potential. In other words, when people have the opportunity to live what a communal kitchen feels like and what a communal library feels like, I think even if nothing happened, right? All those people that experienced that, which happened all over the world, left those places with a totally different experience that I think is going to be the building blocks of the utopia that we're going to be seeing resurfacing to kind of reinvent what kind of society we're going to work with. And so in that sense, I think we need to look more at not just so much the outcomes in terms of the traditional political outcomes of policy change and in structure change, but also outcomes in terms of the lived experience that people brought with them from all these moments of political participation. Thank you. Okay, so now we basically open it to questions, but I don't know. I really think that, I don't know, do we want to listen to what Sasha has to say?
No, let's do questions.
So maybe someone can ask me.
Yeah. I actually wanted to ask both specifically Lindsay and Sasha, like the idea of engaging with these protests through thinking about media, whether it's new media or like the dynamic of new and old and journalism. But like if we think of what's new about these protests, whether starting from the Arab Spring to Spain to Occupy, it's really about what's new about them. It's actually the physical aspect, the body as the central aspect, you know, like having a lot of bodies in the street at the same time. And even when you mentioned that the journalism aspect of reporting on Occupy was when there was physical action, like the spraying of the woman. So where does the body go into your research, the way you're thinking about these questions, and the way you're theorizing new media or the old new media dynamic?
Well, so for me, that was actually the kind of departure point for my investigation with this project, because I was really interested in the twinning of like, it's a digital revolution, and then all these photographs of people in space, right? And that like, so there was that, and I think the signs themselves, even because they're handmade, it's like you can see the trace of the body even in the sign, and oftentimes the images, the people are holding the sign, right? So for me, it's very prevalent. But then I was also interested in like why the images of, in particular, the news use of these images was so recurrent, which is how I kind of got into this other, you know, piece around media reflexivity, which was just really clever. But yeah, for me, it's definitely, I'm with you.
Yeah, I mean, I almost just think I'm looking forward to the time when we don't even have the conversation anymore about online, offline. I mean, I think a lot of us are already there in our scholarship and are thinking about this, and I think there's a broader field shift towards that position, which is sort of thinking about, you know, extensions of the body into different types of, you know, mediated spaces and digital traces that we leave. But I don't know. I'd like to not have to even ask that particular question anymore. Like, is it virtual? Is it real? Yeah.
My question is for Lindsay. And it's a question and a suggestion. So you looked a lot at the content of the signs, and while I was looking at them, what struck me really is the highly individualistic nature of basically persons carrying different signs.
Mm-hmm.
And regardless of the content itself, just looking at how many signs there are in these protests, and the fact that they don't have a unified message actually is a reflection of the nature of these new, very different kinds of social movements, which are supposedly horizontal and decentralized. And this is very much reflected in the sign. And it would be interesting to see, I don't know if you can do a historical kind of comparative research and to see how, if there was a shift from these like big banners, while people who were marching these big banners with this collective kind of unified message, versus today when you look in all these images and you have all of these signs, and this focus on the individual rather than the collective, and there is this media narcissism, but there's also, I feel like maybe there's also a desire to like, you know, create the nicest sign and get in the media.
Yeah, so in the longer paper, I actually kind of frame this more as that like one of the big points of Occupy, the question, what's Occupy's message? Like one of the big messages is like, you can make a message, like it's like this embodied like agency for individuals to make a message, to have their demands heard or publicized, right? And so I think the individuality is certainly important. And I also think that in recent decade, like I guess the last 2 decades, like mass mobilizations of anti-war protests and union organizing, a lot of times they've been like the same message sign, like pre-printed, which can have an interesting visual effect. But I think that the handmade, like literally when you go to an occupied camp, like every occupied camp I was at, which is only like two, but there's a really intentional art space, and there's piles of cardboard and markers, and it's like a banner, make your sign or like make your message, right? So it's like this intentional call to have your own, whatever you want to say, be said, but as a collective, like we're doing this together, we have this space together. So it's not just one or the other, really. And I think that also speaks to your comment about like so much of Occupy was about creating the world you want to live in, because I think that in Occupy in general, like creativity and art was such an important part of it, and that's at the same time that like art is always cut in schools, and the world that we currently live in doesn't prioritize art, right, in the same way. So
I'd like to add that it's also in dialogue with the old social movements of the 1960s, where if you wanted to be a militant, there was already a platform, there was already a message, and you became like a peon, right, behind the agenda that the leaders had designed for the masses. And so obviously this is like the new social movement, where that's not what this is all about, right?
And I will add though, because I think that the visual difference is important, like between the printed sign and the individual sign, handwritten sign. But the protests in the 1970s, like queer liberation protests in the 1970s, were also really clever with like individual messages of like their body and their love life and all stuff like that. So I haven't done like a full-on historical, but that moment in particular is pretty interesting.
Yeah, so it's a question to all four of you. Thank you for really interesting and diverse approach to this topic. My question is, I'm going to try and push you even further to thinking beyond the specific incident, beyond the particular modality, to think a little bit about how your approaches might be in dialogue with other disciplinary approaches to the same phenomena. So particularly I'm interested in if you have any thoughts regarding the ways in which your work engages with journalistic news norms, and then explain some of the kinds of patterns that you've been seeing and the data you've been looking through, why things are brought up, why police or other, what I would consider spokespeople who have cachet and remember catapult their things into that larger space. And then the other literature that I'm interested to hear maybe if you have some thoughts around is social movement literature, broadly speaking, but particularly around tactical repertoires. And I heard several people talking about the strand across time, across movements, across issues, and how particular repertoires are picked up and then carried through biographies. So I'm wondering if there are some connections there. So I just had a class called Network Social Movements, which is sort of a review of what social movement theory, network social movements, media, and mobilization. And so it's basically looking at the evolution of social movement theory, primarily within sociology, as that body of theory sort of changed over the last 40 years, the different paradigm shifts that happened, and the ways that each paradigm thought about the connection between social movements and media space, and then trying to relate that to what is sort of happening with Occupy, but in comparative perspective with another movement. So each student did a paper comparing some aspect of either media production practices or journalistic coverage practices or content analysis, or it could be anything as long as they're talking about two different movements in comparative perspective, drawing on the social movement literature. If you go to networkmovements.wordpress.com, you'll see all of those papers. So there's a great one about the bonus army compared to Occupy Wall Street, veterans movement, depression. There's one comparing sort of the drawing on Keck and C. Kink's boomerang theory of transnational activism, looking at what happened in Occupy Bahrain as an attempt of local sort of Bahraini activists to capitalize on the transnational frame that had been generated and opened by. So first they call it what was it, F29. First they try and use the language of January 25th from the Egyptian context, and then they shift it to the Occupy Bahrain, and now then they shift to the Grand Prix. So anyway, check out those papers, and I think all of that reflects a shared attempt by me and my students to engage with the social movement literature, including some of the press theories around the movement media method.
I've got a question for the two Indignados papers about, have you all collaborated and thought about, because I would be fascinated to see a comparison of the life histories or the story graphs as participants drew them and the news media Twitter hashtags. You seem to have the same time axis. Raise them over each other, I would explode with joy, I think. So I would love to see that. I hope you do it. And if you're interested, I'd love to help.
And keep the handwritten part.
That's what we're But have you guys actually seen anything in print, I guess, especially on like graph data? We notice these things are happening at a particular time that social media would react to spurring things that everybody kind of had a collective sense of. Anything like that?
Certainly, yeah. I think so, definitely. And I think it would help. I think it would help also to. I've just now. This is my first time hearing about the media ecology, which I find really interesting. And I think having some kind of participatory tool on the ground that kind of emphasizes the space within all of that, I think would be very interesting. Because in addition to what you were saying, I think there was also this kind of tendency or qualification too that people had in distinguishing that there were different movements happening online versus in the square, and I think all of that sometimes becomes washed away. But it would be interesting, I think, to go over them. It would be great.
A question for Sasha. I was wondering if you've applied your media ecology approach to other social movements outside of Occupy, and if so, how do the results compare against what you found in Occupy? I'm thinking, for instance, in particular, of what's going on in Montreal right now, which is bringing hundreds of thousands of people onto the street, which might be an opportunity to see kind of what a single issue social movement looks like in comparison to Occupy. And if that's kind of in the process, like if you're thinking through those kind of things, or if you have done that kind of work of mapping your approach onto other social movements.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the goal of the media cultures is to be an approach that I hope people might find compelling enough to use to do comparative work across different movement spaces. And so the slides that I didn't get to are some of the things that I think are interesting aspects of social movement media cultures, but by no means do I think that I have like some exhaustive catalog of the variables of a social movement media culture, but some of the key ones from the Occupy work include, so one is just basic, it's practices. So like, what are the key media production practices within a particular social movement media culture? Another would be sort of this dynamic between open and closed movement media cultures. So I think that in some movement media spaces you would find where message control is very tight. People are trained to stay on message. Spokespeople are carefully selected. There's sort of careful top-down management. So the media practices in that context is relatively closed. Occupy, of course, would be the opposite of that, where there are media trainings, but they're not trainings in what is the message. They're just trainings in similar to the science space, but how do you talk to the press in a soundbite and get your message in, whatever your message may be. So that same type of thing that you described with like, here's how you do a sign, the same thing might happen in terms of how you speak in mass media. So open and closed dynamics, particular media practices. I also think it's interesting to look at the role of experts. So are there people who are considered sort of experts, or who are considered, what are sort of the key actors in this set of skills that they bring to the particular movement media culture? So in some movements, it might be radio makers who play a key role as the movement communicators. In other kinds of places, it might be something else. So those are some of them that came up, but I'm sure there's many more, and I think it's a great opportunity to think about how to do comparative work.
Okay, so we're about run out of time, but Sasha has an announcement, and or some of us are walking to this event, and so if you want to join us.
Yeah, so we're here in Phoenix breaking the boycott against Arizona based on Arizona's hateful SB 1070 anti-immigrant legislation. And so Puente, which is an organization here that's been doing a lot of amazing organizing around that, right now has a mobilization in Cesar Chavez Plaza, which is at 200 West Washington, which apparently is just a few blocks from here, which is organized by the Madres contra Arpaio, Mothers Against Joe Arpaio, who's this crazy guy who's been flaunting federal law and rounding up and deporting people and parading them through the streets literally in chains for the horrible crime of not having proper papers. So some of us are going to head over there and come join us and document it and spread it.
Thank you.
I love the idea of